What's good, everybody? Take KZ back here. We're going to wrap up the trade deadline. Since I did the previews, I figured we might as well do a recap. So let's jump into it here. I found this nifty little chart that shows all the moves in one place. So hopefully we can get through this pretty quick. So let's start first. You had 27 teams make trades over the last couple weeks or so. This is including the Trae Young trade. That was a few weeks ago. Really just the last 3 days. So you have the 3 teams that didn't. You can see with the blank space here. Houston, Miami, and San Antonio. You got those 3 teams are going to make the play-in or the playoffs. In the Heat's case, at least the play-in. I'm most disappointed in the Heat. The Heat had the Terry Rozier expiring contract, so they could have done a few things with it. I think it's very bizarre that they didn't. It's obvious that they were solely focused on Giannis, I think, and weren't planning to do anything else. You can see Orlando here in the top corner here. They did exactly what I expected in the previews. They traded Tyus Jones to get under the tax. They are about 5.5 over. Tyus made 7. So now they're about 1.4 under with an open roster spot. They might even have 2 open roster spots. They can fill both of those and get to 15 if they want. Get out of the tax. They're in the play-in right now, so there's no need to spend that much money this year, especially when they're going to be a second-apron team next year. Let's see, what other teams ducked the tax? I think I can see all 30 on my screen. Most surprising, I think, that ducked the tax was the Celtics. I knew they had a path forward to do it, but they kind of went the more creative way. They traded Anthony Simons for Vucevic with a second-round pick swap. Pretty decent second-rounder they gave up to the Bulls there. It's the Pelicans' second-round pick this year, and they got back Denver's next year. So that should be a top 35 pick that the Bulls got to flip Vooch here. He becomes the Celtics' probably backup center. He fills that Luka Garza role. So nice for the playoff run there. And then they did the trading 3 minimums guys. They dumped Chris Boucher, Josh Minott, and Xavier Tillman. It's a bit unclear what they gave up for Minott. I think they might have just traded him straight to Brooklyn. So Brooklyn get a little trial run with him. It puts them about $1 million under the tax, $1 million and change. They signed, I don't have his name in front of me. They signed one of their 2-way guys for the rest of the year as an undrafted rookie prorated, which was under $500,000. So they can nickel and dime their way with 10-day contracts and stuff to be a couple $1,000s under the tax by year end and have a legal 14-man roster. The main reason they did this, even though they're a potential finals team in the East, is the repeater tax and the penalties that come with it. So they get under it this year. Now they're incentivized if they can stay under it next season. Then they kill the repeater tax altogether, and they have 3 years after that. So we're talking 28, 29, 30, where they're going to be a tax team where they're not paying the additional penalties. Philadelphia 76ers got a gift with the Paul George suspension because he was suspended 25 games. They gave them about like a $5 million tax credit or so. Maybe not quite that much. So they decided that they were going to trade Jared McCain, who had fallen out of the rotation, to the Thunder. This made me happy or unhappy as a Thunder hater because the Thunder got a good player who looked like he was going to be the Rookie of the Year last year for a pretty low price of Houston's first rounder this year in 3 seconds. But for Philly, I kind of got it because Maxey and Edgecombe are your guards of the future, and then they also have Quentin Grimes, who they like, and I think they have a 4th guard that I'm blanking on that they like. So there wasn't like a clear path to playing time for McCain, and he was going to be like the 4th guard at best for them. So they get some assets back for him and duck the tax. They also just dumped Eric Gordon to get them further under, so now they can convert their guys that we talked about in my earlier videos and maybe be a buyout market guy. The Suns did roughly what I expected. They traded Nigel Hayes. They also included Nick Richards. Very bizarre trade, I thought, from the Bucks perspective, to just make a player-for-player swap when they're tanking this year and get no assets back. But that's what they did. So Phoenix got under the tax. That was nice for them. Toronto got under the tax. We knew that was coming. They traded Abaji like I projected. And they ended up getting Tracy Jackson Davis to fill that spot. So they traded Abaji. They didn't have to give up a pick. Oh, they did have to give up a pick to get him off. I'm not sure why they took on the Chris Paul contract to waive him, but then they got Tracy Jackson. So, like I said, they were about $1 million over. They traded a $6 million player and brought in about $4 million in salary back. And the Nuggets did exactly what I thought, trading Hunter Tyson in the second round pick. Looks like they did a second round pick swap. I think he went to the Jazz. I don't remember exactly where he went. And the team I thought was going to try pretty hard to get under the tax, but it was going to be difficult. Actually pulled it off in Dallas. They did this by doing the mega panic trade to trade in Anthony Davis. I guess not necessarily panic. They got to dump D'Angelo Russell along with him. Did cost them Jaden Hardy. And they basically got nothing back from the Wizards. It is almost a straight salary dump. They did get A.J. Johnson, who's on a rookie scale deal. They got 2 quote-unquote firsts and 3 seconds, but those firsts are Oklahoma City's first this year, which is the 30th pick. Essentially, the last pick in the first round, the first pick in the second round. Essentially a second rounder. And then a top 20 Golden State protected pick in 2030, which they only get if it's in the 21 through 30 range. So it's, it's been described as like a first round pick you can put on a press conference, not one you can actually draft a player with. That was just to save face and say they got 2 second rounders, or 2 first rounders for Anthony Davis. But this was a straight salary dump. But Dallas was about $1 million away from being a second apron team, and now they got all the way out of the tax. They got Why am I blanking on how to say this? I'm just going to say Branham. They got Branham's contract from the Wizards. They flipped that for Tyus Jones, so they could have a professional point guard to play next to Cooper Flagg for the rest of the year. It's fine. It's interesting how many moves that were made this deadline by bad teams to just kind of field a competitive roster this year. I guess when you're developing young guys, you want to have a full roster, so you don't want to have a team that has no point guards, no centers. But we saw quite a few moves like that today where it was just player-for-player swaps, just like, hey, we need a wing, you need a guard. Let's just swap guys that neither of us care about, which was interesting. I don't really recall that in years past. And then the last team I guess we could talk about in this section here is the Clippers. The Clippers didn't get quite under the tax, but they made some pretty seismic moves that get them very close. And I believe with buyout rules, if they buy out 1 or 2 guys, they could get under the tax. It'd be kind of tricky like the Celtics, where you're kind of nickel and dime with 10-day contracts and signing guys as late as humanly possible. But I think they do have a pathway to get under the tax. They did this by blowing the whole team up. They traded James Harden for Darius Garland, which actually didn't save them money. They salary dumped Chris Paul, which I think somehow they pulled off without giving up an asset. And then their big move, obviously, was they traded Zubac to Indiana. And they got back Benedict Mathurin, Isaiah Jackson. 2 firsts in a second rounder, and 2 firsts are good first rounders. They got Indiana's 29 unprotected, and then they got this year's pick, if it's pick 5 through 9. Otherwise, it's a 31 unprotected. So those are 2 pretty decent bites of the apple. Zubac is one of the better centers in the league, so they gave up a high price. He's on a good contract, too. So it's a little weird that they sold on him, but they did get a pretty fair value for him. I believe that is all of the tax teams. So then you have the teams that made the trades on the margins here. The Knicks, they didn't want to keep Yabusele. He wasn't a match for them. I can scroll this down. I don't know that you guys can even read these on the screen, but they traded Yabusele in 2 seconds, turned him into Jose Alvarado. So they got a player that didn't really fit with what they were doing. Got Alvarado, who's a nice player. It looks like Miles McBride is going to miss significant time, potentially in the playoffs, so he's really just like a replacement for McBride. So it's kind of a lateral move, but it's a nice little asset pickup. I like Alvarado. Pelicans fans are pretty upset that they lost Alvarado. This was the only thing the Pelicans did. So they got 2 second rounders and cash. And of course they got cash because they're the Pelicans and they're cheap. That's the only thing the Pelicans did. The other thing that's somewhat questionable, I thought, was what Golden State did. I don't really understand why they got Porzingis. I think they just had to get off Kuminga. That situation was too toxic to continue. I think they save a teeny bit of money trading Kuminga and Hield for Porzingis, and they also dumped Jackson Davis. So they save about $2 million. They're also really close to the second apron. So it's even just cutting $2-3 million is pretty significant savings. But Porzingis is battling a chronic injury, not very likely to contribute to them. So a bit of an odd move there. Detroit, I'm a little disappointed in. They did what I expected. I just thought they would get a better player than they got with Kevin Huerter. They technically also have Dario Saric on the roster. I would expect they waive him and play the buyout game as the East 1 seed and potential favorites. You can get a better player there than Saric, and they got plenty of room under the tax. Huerter's a nice player. He's not shooting particularly well this year, so not the best use of their tax space. They gave up Jaden Ivey to get him too, so they gave up an actual asset to get Huerter. So I didn't love that. They did do a pick swap with Minnesota, essentially moving up 5 spots in the draft or so along with it. So they got draft compensation, just low draft compensation. They got Kevin Huerter, which is kind of like a low place to fill that spot. I thought they would do more, something a little better. I know Tyus Jones also hasn't been very great this year. There weren't too many good players that really moved. So maybe Huerter was the best you can do in this ideology of a trade. But I just expected them to get something back a little bit better than that. Let's just work our way bottom up here from here. So the two big swings were by teams that are going to pick in the lottery this year and are going to tank the rest of the year, which is very interesting and a sign of how the aprons are really affecting things. The Wizards, like we said, acquired Anthony Davis essentially for nothing. This is on top of where they did the Trae Young trade earlier this year for basically the same package. They gave up no picks for Trae Young. They gave up 4 second-rounders for Anthony Davis. But really, they're just bringing in 2 All-Stars, 2 All-NBA players that are pretty much toxic assets at this point for nothing. So they're making a real push next year, not into contention. I don't think Trae Young and Anthony Davis do that for you, even in the bizarro world where Anthony Davis plays 82 games. I don't think he puts you in contention. But it gets you out of the basement for a team that's been in the basement for a while. You didn't pay anything to do it. You kept all your best picks. So I got it from that aspect. They don't have cap space anymore. They were supposed to have like $90 million in cap space. They ate it all up in those 2 players. But what are you really going to sign as the Wizards in the offseason with cap space? That's the idea there. You can keep playing this nickel and dime game where you get Chris Middleton for a second. You get this guy for a second, kind of like what the Bulls did. But eventually you got to do something else. So that's what they did here. The Jazz were much more drastic, and they traded 3 first-rounders and 2 rookie-scale players in Taylor Hendricks and Walter Clayton for Jaren Jackson Jr., who is younger, is a little bit more durable than Anthony Davis, but it's kind of the same situation as Anthony Davis, oddly. Jackson doesn't rebound, which I think has always been a major knock on him. But you have Walker Kessler, who is your center, so Jaren Jackson will actually be your power forward. He shoots well enough that he can stretch the floor that way reasonably, and then you would bump Lauri Markkanen down to small forward. So you're kind of doing what the Wolves did a few years ago, where you're just going uber big and making that your identity. You'll be like a defense-first team. Keontae George is taking the lead this year. So he packs your punch scoring-wise. So Jaren Jackson only needs to be your 3rd or 4th best scorer in the starting lineup, which is a nice role for him. So I get the ideology behind that. I just think they cashed in a lot of assets to be essentially a play-in team or like a 6 seed. I can't imagine that squad wins a first-round match. But again, I think they've been in the cellar for 4 years and they just wanted to get out of it. And now they're in a position where they're probably one of the top 8 teams in the West. They're just in that bottom 2 or 3 of the top 8. They recouped a couple assets, doing the Lonzo Ball salary dump, getting 2 second-rounders there. They traded for Chris Boucher, and I think they got a second for that. So they traded 3 first-rounders. They got 3 seconds back. So they did some asset management. They also got Vince Williams and John Conchar in the Jaren Jackson trade. Who are decent little veterans. Vince Williams, not really a veteran. He's like second or third year. But that kind of offsets like trading Walter Clayton. They get Vince Williams back. Somewhat of a lateral move. But it's interesting. It's interesting to give up real assets because they gave up their first rounder next year, which was the best of the three. They still had, I think, one of the Timberwolves first, and then they had the Lakers first next year. And that Timberwolves first, I think, is also like a pick swap. So they didn't give up like necessarily a lottery pick, but I think they gave up 3 first rounders in the teens. So those are real assets they gave up for Jaren Jackson. But it'll be interesting. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe they can actually win a first round playoff. I just don't see it with the roster they have. My team did something I didn't expect and just did a straight salary dump of Mike Conley, trading back about 5 spots in the draft in the first round this year to do it. And then they ended up doing the Ayo DeSumo trade. They dumped Rob Dillingham and Leonard Miller, jumping Rob Dillingham in a sophomore year after trading a first and a pick swap to get him. Stings a bit, but he just hasn't shown any signs on Minnesota. So, and he was the only tradable salary they had. They get DeSumo to essentially replace Nickeil Alexander-Walker. It's going to cost about the same salary. So it seems kind of like bad asset management on the surface, and it is in a sense. But we came into the year thinking Rob Dillingham, Terrence Shannon, and Jalen Clark could be rotation guys, at least like 2 of the 3, 1 of the 3. We went 0 for 3 on those guys. So that's a big bummer. But they replace them with the Sumu here. This doesn't take anything away from a potential Giannis trade in the offseason, which is why I think they really sat on it for a couple days before doing it. 4 second rounders are real assets. We only had 6, so we don't have much tradable stuff left. But DeSumo, I don't think is restricted free agent, but most teams ate up their cap space, which I think is also why we pulled the trigger, because I think we'll be able to resign him to a fairly reasonable deal. Milwaukee had one of the weirder. I scrolled over here. That's why. Milwaukee had one of the weirder trade deadlines. I think just doing one trade that's just player for player. Don't really get what they're doing. I don't know why they felt they needed Ousmane Deng. I guess he's a former first-round pick that's never really gotten a chance at playing time. That he'll get 3 months in Milwaukee to see if he's anything. It's not like Cole Anthony or Amir Coffey had any value, but they just helped the Suns get out of the tax and really got nothing out of it, and that's the only thing they did. The Kings did a very Kings trade, trading real stuff for DeAndre Hunter, even though he's having arguably one of the worst years of his career. They traded Keon Ellis, Dennis Schroeder, Dario Saric, and 2 second-round picks to get DeAndre Hunter and overpay him next year. He is a 3-and-D wing, which there is a scarcity in the league still, but he's not really doing 3s or Ds this year, so it's weird. And Keon Ellis seemed like one of the real trade assets on the block this year because he's on a minimum salary, so all 30 teams could acquire him. So you could potentially get some real assets for him in the form of like second-round picks. I don't think anyone was giving up a first for him. They restructured and moved some stuff around to sign Dennis Schroeder to a 3-year deal last year in the offseason, just to turn around and sign Russell Westbrook and think the Dennis Schroeder contract was a bad contract. So they gave up assets to dump it about 4 months later onto Cleveland. This move saved Cleveland a lot of money. We might as well transition right to them on the left here. They also dumped Lonzo Ball, like we talked about, to the Jazz. So they got Keon Ellis to replace DeAndre Hunter. They got Dennis Schroeder to replace Lonzo Ball. They saved about $100 million in luxury tax space. They didn't get quite under the second apron, which is really going to hurt them in their pursuit of Giannis because it locks their 2033 pick from being traded in the offseason. So they didn't acquire an extra tradable first by ducking the second apron. They didn't quite get there. They did get better this year. They also did the Darius Garland, James Harden swap. They had to give up a second in that trade, so they gave up 3 seconds, which was all their tradable seconds, to turn Garland, Lonzo Ball, and DeAndre Hunter into Keon Ellis, Dennis Schroeder, and James Harden. But those are three upgrades, even though they have really underwhelmed this year in the East. The East is still wide open, and this is kind of a make or break year. And the value in the James Harden trade is he has a player option next year, or no, it's a team option. So you can either extend James Harden if you like what he gives you over the next 3 months here, or you can just not pick up that option and you get out of the second apron. You might even get all the way out of the tax by doing that. I don't think they'll get quite that far under. So you gained a lot of flexibility that they just didn't previously have by getting out of the Hunter and Garland contracts. They would have to re-sign Keon Ellis, which is going to cost a decent amount of money, not James Harden level money though. So they gained a lot of flexibility and got better. I did like what Cleveland did. It didn't feel like quite enough, but they made some real moves, I think. I'm scrolling on the wrong screen again. Portland did something very small, but I thought was nice. They have a clear path here to be a legitimate play-in team and potentially be the 8 seed with how Golden State season has fared. So they traded Duop Reith, who was out for the year in 2 seconds, for Vit Krejci. Krejci is a nice little role player. He's filling in as their 7th, 8th guy off the bench. So they got a legitimate rotation guy, basically for nothing. They have a pretty decent dearth of picks, with selling Dame Lillard and all that stuff in the subsequent moves of the Dame Lillard trade. Their GM's been pretty savvy. It's been accumulating assets, accumulating good players like Denny Abdia and Tumari Kamara and all that stuff. So they have a legitimate team. Not anything that can do damage in the playoffs, but in a weak West that only has 7 good teams, they're definitely in the hunt to be the 8th seed, and that's something their fans would really enjoy this year. So I like that they did that. The Grizzlies continued their teardown after trading Desmond Bane in the offseason, trading Jaren Jackson. They also took on Eric Gordon for a second-round pick swap, just to get a couple more assets there. I'm not sure if they waived George Niang or Kyle Anderson to do that, but they're going to ultimately waive, I think, Kyle Anderson, Niang, and Eric Gordon. Just play the kids, try to tank. They control their pick this year. They'll try to shop Ja again on the offseason. They tried to trade him at the deadline, but they want to essentially just get out of the money, not necessarily get picks. But the Ja contract is just a tough contract to stomach. So they weren't able to shop that or trade that, but they could potentially trade it in the offseason. The Bucks seem delusional to think that they can still woo Giannis to stay. So I wouldn't rule out them doing like a Kyle Kuzma and Bobby Portis trade for Ja in the offseason if they get an inkling that Giannis might stay. I wouldn't be shocked if the Kings traded for Ja, because the Kings are way over the tax right now for next year, even though they're the worst team in the West. So they're going to have to do some desperate stuff in the offseason. We'll come back to the Bulls because the Bulls I'm going to have to zoom in on. They did so much stuff. The Lakers just did a nice clean swap, bringing in another white guy because they needed more white guys on this team, giving up Gabe Vincent and a second-round pick for Luke Kennard. I don't really know what Kennard gives them, but they didn't already have. But they saved a teeny bit of money here as a tax team. I thought the Lakers might try to get under the tax, but it would cost them like a first-round pick swap, if not an outright first-round pick. So I'm not shocked they didn't do that. We talked briefly about the Clippers. We talked about Philly. The Pacers made a big trade to get Zubac. I like what they did. They did give up this year's pick, probably, with how desperately teams are tanking. They might potentially hang on to it. I think, oddly, even though they're the 3rd worst record right now, I think they have a better chance of keeping that pick if it's the 10th pick than they do if it's a top 4 pick. Because I just think everyone's going to tank harder than them. They do keep it if it's a top 4. But I think they're just ready to go to war when they get Halliburton back next year. The Thunder consolidated some picks to bring in Jared McCain for a low price. That was a very savvy move by them. I hate that they did it. For their least desirable draft assets for Jared McCain, and then they flip a 5th pick, a 4th second, to swap Ousmane Deng for Mason Plumlee, so they stay under the tax this year. Atlanta, I thought, had a pretty nice trade deadline all in all. They didn't do much, but they just kind of stayed the same while picking up a few assets, which I think is savvy. So they essentially swapped Trey Young for C.J. McCollum. They swapped Vic Krejci for Cody Kessler. They swapped Porzingis for Jock Landale. They swapped Luke Kennard for Buddy Hield, and then they got Gabe Vincent and Jonathan Kuminga on top of it, along with 3 second-round picks. So they kind of just moved laterally in a lot of ways. I mean, I guess they are slightly worse, but they're probably going to make the play-in anyway. It's between them and the Bulls, I guess, and the Hornets for the 9-10 slot. 2 of those 3. The Hornets are going for it, so I'm just penciling the Hornets in. And I think Atlanta's team is still better than the Bulls. The Nets didn't do quite as much as I thought they would. They did 3 salary dump trades. I thought they would do more, do something a little more seismic, but they really didn't. They got a second-round pick swap and a second to get Abaji, Josh Minott, and Hunter Tyson. I think they'll potentially keep all 3 of those guys. I didn't see the third guy they waived. They waived Cam Thomas. They waived Haywood Highsmith. And they would have to waive a third, which would probably be Tyrese Martin or is it Jalen Wilson? Or they would waive one of Tyson or Minott. I could see them waiving Tyson. It depends which guy they like more. Tyson's a little younger and is on a cost-controlled salary next year, where Wilson and Martin are both expirings, and they're more closer to their prime, like fringe NBA players. They've played really well for Brooklyn, given who they are, but there's no real long-term future there, so it doesn't really matter regardless. Brooklyn's tanking. Charlotte, I thought, was very savvy. They're maybe the biggest winner, I think, on the deadline, just because they traded 3 second-round picks to get Kobe White, and then they were a dumping ground and got 3 seconds back. So they essentially got Kobe White for free. How they did that is they got a second-round pick for trading Mason Plumlee for Ousmane Deng, taking on $4 million there. They traded 3 second-round picks, Deng and Colin Sexton, for Kobe White and Mike Conley. They then got 2 second-round picks to absorb Tyus Jones. And then they swapped Tyus Jones for Malachi Branham. I don't think they got a pick in that, which was kind of weird, but it saved them a couple $1 million. They're going to waive Mike Conley. They were going to waive Pat Connaughton. I think they got to waive one more guy. It might be Malachi Branham to bring in Xavier Tillman. But they just moved a bunch of fringe stuff to get Kobe White, and essentially wash it out. They got some cash for their trouble too. I think that is every team except the Bulls. So let's just talk about what the Bulls did. I actually like what the Bulls did. This is too zoomed in for your guys' screen here, but. So the Bulls took advantage of their expiring contracts and just made a mess of their roster, but they picked up, I think, 9 second-rounders altogether. It's easy to clown them because they got so many guards, which was funny. But you see here, they took on Dario Saric's contract for 2 seconds. They flipped that and Herter for Jaden Ivey. They got a pick swap to turn Vucevic into Anthony Simons. They got 3 seconds for trading Kobe White for Colin Sexton. And then they got 4 seconds for trading Ayo Dosunmu for Rob Dillingham and Leonard Miller. And then they just did some other fringe stuff too. So they ended up with 7 point guards on the roster, which is weird. I think they could potentially buy out Anthony Simons or Colin Sexton. But those are 2 of their more playable guys. It depends, I guess, if they really care about making the play-in or not. There's not much upside in that. I don't see them making the playoffs. They could potentially get a 9 seed and host a play-in game, which I guess is extra revenue. But that's all they're really playing for. But yeah, they picked up 9 second-round picks, which you can argue they didn't maximize Dosunmu and Kobe White waiting until the end. Same with Vucevic, which is true. but they did what they had to do at the deadline. They brought in Jaden Ivey um, to try him out, which is another reason I think they might waive Simons and Colin Sexton. They'll prioritize playing Ivy over everyone. Um, it's just a lot of guards, and if some of these other teams did stuff where they brought in centers. They traded for Nick Richards, so they would have a healthy center on the roster. You probably want to get wings. There's not a whole lot of wings out there, but you can maybe get George Niang or Chris Middleton or something, and just waive Sexton or Simons or both. Um, I don't know that they necessarily care that they got Rob Dillingham, but he was the 8th overall pick last year, so I think freeing up playing time for him would make sense too. We'll see. The Bulls aren't super relevant this year, but I did think overall the total package they did, getting 9 second-round picks, was nice. Their roster is worse, but not significantly worse, and they're not super relevant regardless. So the big winners, the big acquisitions were Utah and Washington. They definitely made their teams better. I like what Washington did a little more because there's not really a downside to it. The Pacers made the biggest splash, I think, impact-wise. It's just not going to be this season. So those are the 3 biggest swings. Were all for next year, which is very bizarre for the trade deadline. I think the Wolves got slightly better. I think that might be the only playoff team that got better, oddly. Yeah, I think it is. The Pistons turned Jaden Ivey into Herter. That's probably about a lateral move. I don't think the Wolves did enough to get into championship contention. But they're the only team that made a winning trade out of the top 5 or so. So very odd deadline, but very exciting nonetheless. All right, we'll call it there. I'm running out of things to talk about. Have a good night, guys. Bye.